36-year-old Kevin O'Keefe was a native of Sacramento, California. He was an avid hiker, and it was his lifelong dream to do so in Alaska. So in 1985, he began putting that trip together, deciding on Glacier Bay National Park. This area is very remote, so much so that most people arrive at the park by water. On September 20th, 1985, Kevin flew from Sacramento to Juneau, Alaska. He introduced himself to the on-duty park rangers at the park headquarters, told them he'd be out in the Wolf Point area, and that he planned to come back out on October 11th. Now that everyone knew where he would be, he chartered a float plane to take him out to Wolf Point, and no one saw or heard from him for a couple weeks. On October 8th, a couple days before he was scheduled to come out, park rangers were patrolling the waters near Wolf Point. Knowing that Kevin was there, they decided they would pop in just to make sure everything was all right. When they came around the last bend and saw Kevin's campsite, their first impressions were that something was wrong. His tent was in the wrong spot, and most of his gear was outside. The top support for the tent was buckled and looked like it had been broken in the center. The rangers yelled out for Kevin, and when they didn't get a response, they figured he must have gone out for a day hike. They got back in their boat and continued on their patrol. The same two rangers were patrolling the same area the next day and decided to pop over to Wolf Point again and check on Kevin. When they came around that last bend, they found the campsite in exactly the same state as the day before. It was obvious that Kevin had not returned to the campsite, and now they knew something was wrong. The rangers radioed their discovery into the ranger station, and a search was started. Planes flew over the Wolf Point area, while ground searchers with dogs started at the campsite and fanned out from there. What puzzled the search teams was that they found Kevin's pack fully packed with clothes and drinking water laying against a tree, ready to be taken on a hike. He had lots of food out in the open, but strangely no animals had come in for it. As the ground searchers got out to about half a mile from the campsite, they found Kevin's boots, hat, and glove liners in a ravine not visible from the air. First thoughts were that Kevin had been attacked by a bear, but to one veteran park ranger who knew the area well, this didn't make any sense. First, there was no sign of a struggle anywhere. There was no blood, no pieces of clothing, no nothing. It stands to reason that if Kevin were attacked, there would at least be something left behind to indicate that. Second was the food. If a bear or some other animal had come into the campsite and attacked Kevin, they would have also taken the food that was just laying out in plain sight. Rangers noticed that, strangely, no animals were coming in anywhere near the campsite. Ground teams expected and prepared for animal encounters, but there were none. It was almost like they were avoiding the area. Police went to Kevin's family and asked for his background and any other information they could give. They said that Kevin was super excited about the trip and planned on taking simple day hikes while he was out there, nothing overnight. He was just super stoked about being all by himself out in the beautiful Alaska wilderness for a couple weeks. Meanwhile, the search teams continued working the area from both the ground and air for a few more days, but without finding anything, ended up eventually calling off the search. All investigators knew is that it was unlikely that Kevin had been out on one of his day hikes, because all of his gear was still at the campsite, and he certainly wouldn't wander off without his supplies. So they believed that whatever happened to Kevin O'Keefe had to have happened at the campsite. But what did happen? Why were his hats, boots, and glove liners found in a ravine half a mile away? Animal attack seems unlikely, since there would be clear evidence of such an attack. There were no signs of a death struggle, and then there's the issue of the food. Why was the food that was sitting out in the open go untouched? Why did it seem like the animals were avoiding the area? Early in the morning of February 19th, 1999, Dr. Katherine Wong, along with her husband John, two of their kids, and two other relatives, left their home just outside of San Francisco and headed to the Bear Valley Ski Resort 3.5 hours away, just south of Lake Tahoe. Dr. Wong was a 47-year-old pediatrician in San Jose and was an avid skier. The Wongs hit the slopes as soon as they arrived and skied until about 11:30 a.m. when the family went up to the lodge to have lunch. After they were finished eating, the kids and the other relatives decided to stay back at the lodge for a bit, so John and Katherine went back out to the slopes. After a while, they decided they would go down separate trails. They would meet up at the bottom where the two trails converged. John got to the bottom first and waited for Katherine to arrive. After waiting a little while, he started to worry that she may have fallen and hurt herself, so he went back up the trail she was using and didn't see her anywhere. John continued looking for about half an hour and then notified the ski patrol. So the ski patrol heads out and found no tracks where anyone had left the trail, so they quickly notified the sheriff's office and they assembled the search effort. Search teams that afternoon combed all 75 trails at the resort and couldn't see one spot where anyone had left the trail. Searchers continued looking for 2 more days until a major cold front came in and triggered a massive snowstorm, making it too dangerous for the search to continue. Investigators believe that with the amount of snow and the sub-freezing temperatures, that it was unlikely that Katherine could have survived. Rumors flew around the resort that Katherine had possibly been murdered, or that she engineered her own disappearance. The only proof investigators had that Katherine was even there was the closed-circuit security tapes, so investigators started looking into Katherine's personal life. All they could find was that John and Katherine had been happily married for 20 years with no personal or financial problems. John volunteered to take a polygraph test and passed with flying colors. 4 months after she disappeared, in June of 1999, Katherine's remains and equipment were found in a deep gully half a mile south of the resort. The area was heavily wooded and far away from any of the trails. Her remains were scattered over a quarter mile at the bottom of a ravine. Searchers had eliminated this area from the search grid back in February since the terrain was so steep and difficult to get to. Add to that 8-foot-high snowdrifts between the resort and the ravine that would have made it nearly impossible for Katherine to get there. So how did she get to the bottom of that ravine? Some speculate an animal attack, but if that were the case, why was there no sign of a struggle or no tracks found leading off any of the 75 trails at the resort? On January 29, 1975, a 19-year-old photographer named Charles McCuller was touring the national parks in the western United States when he decided to check out Crater Lake National Park in Oregon. Charles knew that his van, a Volkswagen, wouldn't make it all the way into Crater Lake, so he asked a friend with a 3-wheeler ATV to take him out there. On the way, Charles half-jokingly told his friend that if he didn't hear from him in a couple days, to file a missing persons report. A couple days later, that's exactly what happened. When Charles failed to meet up with his friend for a ride out, he filed the missing persons report, and a huge search effort descended on Crater Lake. Not one trace of Charles was found. Charles's father went up to Crater Lake and stayed for several months, out searching nearly every day. Fast forward 1 year, a couple hikers were in the Crater Lake area and found themselves lost. Once they got their bearings and figured out where they were on the map, they figured that they were miles away from the closest trail. So as they're making their way back to the trail system, they stumbled upon a backpack just laying on the ground. In it, they found a very distinctive key to a Volkswagen. The hikers noted on the map where they found this backpack, and once they got back to civilization, turned the backpack into police and showed them where it was found. The backpack and key were identified as belonging to Charles McCuller, and searchers were sent back out to the area, starting where the backpack was found, which was 12 miles from the closest trail. A short distance away, they found the remains of Charles McCuller. His pants were laying on a log, with socks sticking out of the pant legs. The socks had the skeletal remains of his feet inside them. Strangely, the upper half of Charles's body was missing, with the exception of a small portion of what is believed to be his skull found 12 feet away. Searchers described the scene as if Charles had been sitting on the log 1 second and the next he was gone, and only his clothing remained. Investigators would rule that Charles had died of natural causes. The family didn't accept the ruling, arguing that his head was obviously detached from his body. His shoes, jacket, and equipment were all missing, and the fact that he was found 12 miles from the closest trail. Adding to the mystery was that the area received 6 feet of fresh snowfall, so how could he have moved 12 miles through 6 feet of snow? Today, the official cause of death is still listed as natural causes, specifically exposure. On Friday, June 13, 1969, 6-year-old Dennis Martin, along with his brother Douglas, father William, and grandfather Clyde, arrived at the Great Smoky Mountains National Park for their yearly camping trip. There they would meet up with other family members and hike to Spence Field. Dennis Martin was known to be adventurous, and the camping trip was something he looked forward to every year. On the first night, Clyde would meet and become friends with Carter Martin and his 2 sons. The 2 groups of Martins were not related. Seeing that they all got along so well, Clyde invited Carter and his boys to camp out with them at the Russell Field shelter. The next morning, Clyde, Bill, Dennis, and Douglas, along with Carter and his 2 sons, set out for Spence Field, where they would set up camp for the night. The group arrived later that day, set up their campsite, and the 4 young boys went off to play. Later that afternoon, the kids decided they would all hide just inside the tree line so they could jump out and scare the adults as they passed by. The 3 older kids stopped and told Dennis, who was wearing a bright red shirt, to go farther down the trail and hide. The other kids thought the bright red shirt would give away their position. So the kids all hid in the wood line and, sure enough, startled the adults when they passed by. Once the shock and excitement wore off, everyone noticed that Dennis was nowhere to be found. It was between 4 and 4:30 p.m., and Dennis had only been on his own for less than 5 minutes. Bill yelled for Dennis but got no response, so he started walking down the Appalachian Trail, expecting and hoping that Dennis would suddenly jump out and try to scare him. But he didn't. Bill returned to Spence Field to let the others know he still couldn't find his son, and the others joined in the search except for Clyde, who started an almost 9-mile hike to the ranger station near Cades Cove. Once there, he reported Dennis missing to the rangers, who in turn notified authorities. Shortly after Dennis disappeared, the weather conditions took a turn. Heavy rains moved in, dropping 3 inches in a matter of hours, which made the surrounding tough terrain even more difficult. Temperatures that first night dropped to nearly 50 degrees. The rangers and the 2 groups of Martins continued searching around Spence Field as additional search parties were brought in, and by June 15th, the search had expanded into the largest ever undertaken by the National Park Service to date. Over 1,400 people participated, including park rangers, firefighters, police, and a lot of volunteers. Tracking dogs were brought in, and Special Forces soldiers from Fort Bragg arrived to assist. The only piece of evidence found was a set of footprints near West Prong on June 17th. The print was of the same style and size as what Dennis had been wearing. Oddly, whoever made these footprints was only wearing 1 shoe. The FBI joined the search on June 18th, but by the 29th, after 2 weeks of exhaustive searching and over 56 square miles covered, the search effort was terminated. 3 rangers would continue small search operations on their own until mid-September. Many lessons were learned by the National Park Service on how to conduct an organized search from this case. They found that huge numbers of searchers, mostly volunteers, without structured organization was actually a detriment. They needed much better coordination and organization. On July 21st, the media received a report from a camper named Harold Key, who had been camping in the park on the day of Dennis's disappearance. Harold said that his wife and 3 kids were in the C branch near Rowan's Creek, hoping to catch a glimpse of a wild animal, when they heard a blood-curdling scream. Key made the following statement: "My sons and I were looking for bears when we heard a terrible scream. We walked on about 200 yards and my sons said they could see a bear. but it wasn't a bear. It was a man hiding in some bushes. He was definitely avoiding us. Not thinking too much of it at the time, Key put it at the back of his mind, and the family continued on with their camping trip. Only after he heard of the Dennis Martin disappearance did he contact park officials and the FBI and took them to the location where this encounter took place. The newspapers said that authorities doubted this bear, man, and scream were related to the Martin case, largely due to the distance between Rowan's Creek and Spence Field, which, if one were to stick to the established trails, would be a distance of 7 miles. Key told authorities this happened between 4 and 5 p.m. While the National Park Service lists Dennis Martin's time of disappearance as 4:30 p.m., that doesn't give a lot of time for a person to make a 7-mile trip, but these times are only estimates. Bill Martin was irate when he heard about the story. Authorities and park officials hadn't even bothered to tell him about it. He found out through the newspaper. He thought this was clear evidence that his son had been taken by someone or something. In the 50 years since, there have been no new developments in the Martin case. How does a 6-year-old boy vanish off the face of the earth in a span of under 5 minutes? Why was there nothing besides the footprints found when there were over 1,400 searchers out looking for him? In 2014, James McGrogan was a 39-year-old physician from Indiana. He had been practicing in Wisconsin, but had recently returned home to Indiana to work in the emergency room at St. Joseph Regional Medical Center in Mishawaka. To celebrate his return home, Jim and a group of friends decided to go to Vail for a skiing trip. Vail is a small community at the base of Vail Mountain in Colorado, a popular ski resort lying inside the White River National Forest. Jim and his friends enjoyed split snowboarding, a hybrid of sorts of snowboarding and cross-country skiing. In split snowboarding, the board is cut in half, and each half becomes a ski. This makes climbing uphill much easier and allows easier access to untracked areas for exploring. At 8:30 a.m. on March 14, 2014, the group set out on their first trek. They planned a 9-mile hike first to the Eisman Hut, and then on to Camp Hale, where they would set up camp for the night. The trails in that area were reported to have a lot of snow, but they were so well traveled that they were heavily compacted, so even though the trail systems around Vail were well marked, there was no mistaking where the established trail was. The trip up to Eisman Hut was steep and treacherous. As the crow flies, Eisman Hut is only 4 miles from Vail, but to follow the trail would make the trip 9 miles. Jim had come well prepared, bringing along an avalanche beacon, cell phone, satellite GPS, extra clothing, basic medical supplies, and enough food and water to last for a few days. All went as planned for the first 90 minutes until they got to the first rest stop. It was around 10 a.m., and Eisman Hut was still about 5 miles away. While the others rested, Jim decided he wanted to push on, so he told his companions he was going ahead and would wait for them at the next pre-planned stop. But when the rest of the group got there, Jim was nowhere to be found. Not overly concerned, they figured Jim got sick of waiting for them and decided to forge on ahead. So when the group made it to Eisman Hut, they were alarmed to find that Jim wasn't there. They hadn't passed him along the way, and there were no tracks where anyone had left the trail. After waiting for a bit and still no sign of Jim, they knew something was wrong. By late afternoon, a search and rescue operation was underway with the Eagle Valley Sheriff's Department and volunteers searching every inch of an 18-mile grid surrounding Vail. Knowing that Jim had enough provisions to last at least a couple days, they were optimistic that he would be found. Searchers on foot, air, and snowmobiles scoured the area. They found no tracks going off of any of the well-marked and defined trails around Vail. On April 3rd, so 2.5 weeks after Jim disappeared, his body was found by a group of backcountry skiers 4.5 miles off the closest trail near Booth Falls, well to the east of Eisman Hut. This 4.5 miles is as the crow flies. Given the terrain and the route one would have to take, the trip from Eisman Hut to where Jim was found was nearly 14 miles. Search teams had spent a combined 1,000 hours searching for Jim and had searched the Booth Falls area multiple times. Jim was found at the bottom of a small ravine, still wearing his helmet, but his jacket, gloves, and boots were missing. Next to him was his backpack, containing his still working GPS, cell phone, food, water, and tent. There were no footprints or ski tracks anywhere near the remains. On April 7th, Eagle County Medical Examiner Kara Bettis said that Jim had died of multiple injuries, significant head trauma, as well as trauma to the left side of his chest and a broken femur. The injury seemed consistent with a fall from a great height. Jim McGrogan's death was ruled an accident and the case was closed. How could Jim go from the ski trail to the bottom of a ravine 14 miles away and not leave any tracks? Why were there no footprints or tracks around the body? Why hadn't Jim's body been found when the area had been thoroughly searched several times previously? Was the body there and the searchers just missed it? If it wasn't, where was Jim during that time? And why didn't he call for help? What happened to his jacket, gloves, and boots? And finally, how did he sustain the significant injuries that led to his death? In 1969, Robert Winters was a 78-year-old man living in Oregon. A retired logger, he loved the outdoors. In early October, Robert, along with his 3 sons, headed out on their annual hunting trip to Spark Lake. The family had been hunting that area for 20 years, so they knew the area extremely well. Their campsite was at the base of a mountain they would venture up and hunt. The first few days went by with no issues, until October 8th, when they found out a massive snowstorm would be hitting the area that night. They still wanted to hunt during the day, so they decided not to go up the mountain, but hunt closer to the campsite. The 4 men headed out to their hunting spots around a nearby lake. As it began to get dark, the men one by one made their way back to the campsite, except Robert. As night fell and the snow started, his sons went back out to the lake to look for him, but they quickly realized that they were going to need some help. The sheriff's office was notified, and they launched a massive search effort almost immediately. Within 24 hours, 1.5 feet of fresh snow had fallen, and Robert had not yet been found. Helicopters were brought in to search from the air, as the heavy snows had seriously impacted the ground teams. Before long, a helicopter radioed in that they had found tracks not far from the lake at an elevation of 7,100 feet. Authorities shrugged off the idea that it could be Robert, as he would have had to travel upward 2,000 feet during the snowstorm to have made those tracks. Robert and his sons had all agreed not to go any higher in elevation than the campsite, given the storm that was coming. Robert had spent the majority of his life out in the woods, and he certainly knew better than to move to a higher elevation, especially in the middle of a snowstorm. As you get to higher elevations, the temperature drops even farther and increases the risk of hypothermia. 5 days after Robert had disappeared, the search was called off, with no further evidence found. In July 1970, so 9 months after Robert vanished, a doctor who was in the Sparks Lake area at the spot where the footprints were found came across a hunting rifle, some clothes, a boot, a glove, and a pair of glasses lying next to a tree. The doctor called the sheriff's office and all the items were identified as belonging to Robert Winters. Search teams were brought in, but found no remains. So was Robert Winters dead? Authorities had the clothing, but no body. Strangely, the rifle was leaning up against a tree, and the clothing and the other items were stacked neatly next to it. A year later, in 1971, dentures were found in the same area that were found to be Robert's, but they still had no remains. Eventually, Robert's family petitioned the court to have Robert legally declared dead, but the medical examiner refused, saying there was no evidence that he had died. It took more than a year to get them to sign off on a death certificate. By then, Even the medical examiner concluded that even with no remains, it would have been impossible for Robert to still be alive. Robert knew the area well enough and was certainly adept enough in the woods to know that you don't go up a mountain during a major snowstorm, take off your clothing, and put it neatly next to a tree. But if Robert didn't do that, how did his belongings make it up there? And whose tracks were found at 7,100 feet? Were they Robert's? Or someone or something else?